This is Climate Dialogues, where we speak to climate leaders on key decisions and outcomes during the 2023 Africa Climate Summit. I am Saida Swale. Thank you very much for making time for us, Mr. Philip. Welcome to Climate Dialogues. Let's start by a brief introduction of yourself and what you do here.
Well, thanks, and it's a great pleasure to have me in this Climate Dialogues. My name is Philip Kilonzo. I aid the policy, advocacy, and communications work of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. The Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, as the name suggests, is actually a continental alliance, bringing all the actors involved in climate change to drive policy discourse for the continent. And my role entails clearly supporting countries to be quite articulate in terms of influencing policy, but also shaping continental dialogues. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So just to start us off, just for the sake of our audience, what is climate justice?
Well, this is a quite a complex subject, but also very, that can be explained in a quite an easy manner. Climate justice draws from or climate justice principles draws from the imperatives of what has actually taken place over time. We are clear that there are countries that have actually been responsible for historical and both current emissions. We are clear that these countries have actually emitted far beyond what is their fair atmospheric emission levels. And it is clear that as a result of their emissions, countries that emitted less are extremely or are getting disenfranchised or affected by the impacts of climate change. So climate justice dialogue comes in to then begin to bridge the conversation and beginning to ask who is responsible for the climate atrocities that vulnerable nations and vulnerable communities are facing, and what is that they need to do to take action in terms of, one, cutting on their emission, which is extremely critical, but equally paying for the damages done, reparations, which is the common term that we use in this particular context, meaning that they need to make good whatever they meant was in whichever context. But it goes deeper than to ask more about our production models and methods, which are in application in global scale, and how are these again worsening the Earth's temperature, and how this again is playing in terms of worsening impacts of climate change. So it's more of taking an historical look at those who have been responsible for emissions, for their actions, which are either actions informed by errors of omission or commission, but also beginning to look at their current practices and whether indeed they are responsive to the current suffering of the masses, and then ensuring that we bring them to action in terms of ensuring that they are able to implement speedy measures in cutting on emissions, but equally making funding available to countries that need it most so that they are able to adapt their livelihood systems.
Okay, so having said that, why then is climate justice very critical in the African context?
When you look at Africa, it's a continent with the least emission. But a continent that has also suffered quite a history of disenfranchisement. Africa is a continent that suffered the era of slavery. It's a continent that also suffered the era of extraction of raw materials without necessarily developing the continent itself. When you do a quick introspection, you will realize it's like there is a correlation between development and levels of emission and poverty, such that when you look at Africa, a continent that suffered from a protracted period of extraction of resources without local processing, and again with the industrialization capacity being developed in the north, then you will find Africa still falls far beyond the milestones that are actually expected in terms of development. Yet again, when you look at the developed countries, you'll find that they've developed further using materials from Africa, but also emitting more gases to the atmosphere. So the climate justice question in this particular regard plays into ask, did the developed countries develop, one, at the expense of African countries in terms of materials, number two, in terms of pollution, And then it also begins to ask the question of then who is most impacted as a result of production of these gases. And that is where the African continent now comes in as a continent that is most impacted as a result of all these emissions, because we have sort of triple challenges as a continent. We have the challenge of poverty, meaning that those who are affected then get to be affected much more deeply by the impacts of climate change. We are located in the tropics, meaning that any slight increment in temperatures, the Earth's temperatures, means disproportionately high increment of temperatures within the African continent because of its location, again, which is also another disadvantage. And then the third one is the capacity. Beginning to see that Africa, having been again dispossessed of its wealth and resources and opportunities for growth, then it's also less prepared in terms of its ability and its capacity to respond to the vagaries of climate change. So any justice question then must go to the historical elements that led to disfranchisement of the continent, but it must also respond to the current realities in terms of what needs to happen. For instance, right now as we speak, we are seeing the continent of Africa falling deeper into debt. The debt challenge means that Africa continent cannot even basically deliver the services that are needed, let alone respond to issues of climate change. But when you also look at overall in Africa, then you realize the African continent and economies are actually spending quite a lot of resources, enabling their communities to adapt to vagaries of climate change. That element of struggle then brings the justice element. Why should African continent struggle addressing humanitarian crisis of people and enabling communities to adapt, while again this problem has been caused by countries in the north? Yeah.
Okay. Let's now talk about the Africa Climate Summit. What are some of your key outcomes from the summit?
Before we get to the African Climate Summit, I think it's important to appreciate the fact that Africa needed a space to have a conversation with itself. And part of what Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance was pushing for is for Africa to have a clear space that is clearly cut for African dialogues, where Africa is able to shape its position, shape its agenda, and also develop its own strategies for engaging with the North. That has been a defining request from the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. But going to the African Climate Summit, we first celebrated when a decision was made in the 36th Assembly of the African Union that African Climate Summit will be there. And we were clear it's going to be convened in Nairobi. But the processes that characterized the African Climate Summit were quite telling in terms of the interests that were there, largely foreign to African continent. And these interests were basically aimed at still ring fencing and protecting the gains for the Western nation rather than the African nations. Now, coming to the African Climate Summit, yes, PACJA played quite a pivotal role in terms of Pan-African mobilizing, not only for the civil society actors, but in a broad way, the non-state actors to plug into the process. But part of our mobilization was also to sensitize African governments on what is at stake within the conference itself and the need for the summit itself to coin an African position that is critical. So that was a kind of spectrum that PACJA was actually involved in terms of driving the influence process. But more fundamentally, the African Climate Summit meant some resounding pronouncement in some certain areas, particularly around decarbonization. How do we decarbonize economies, but how do we push our northern counterpart, the developed north, to have much more sound framework for decarbonizing. Unfortunately, that plan was not well coined in terms of how African leaders will hold these actors to account, which was which ideal ought to have been part of the bold decision in terms of African nations making a determination in terms of how to hold the North to account. But there were quite a number of build-up decision on the same around decarbonization, including scaling up access to renewable energy, which was very critical. And there were also other gains that were realized as a result of push that was actually being done by the civil society. in terms of the loss and damage agenda, which was not part of the initial conversation within the African Climate Summit. I think the element of climate finance also featured quite strongly within the summit, but those who saw the initial versions of even the declaration can attest to the fact that there was quite a push towards carbon market as a funding mechanism for climate change, which ideally is a forced solution. So the ability of institutions to push back again towards ensuring that we are able to go back and demand for funding from the developed north came in. The only element that was not clear is what are we pursuing? Are we pursuing the $100 billion US dollars, which has remained with its own contestation, or are we pushing for a much more ambitious commitment in terms of funding that comes to the continent?
Okay.
Thanks.
And still on the summit, were there any particular resolutions that resonated with what you do as PACJA?
Absolutely. Quite a number of recommendations that came in resonate with what we are pushing for, and even some of the positions of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. We've been clear on the decarbonization agenda, that we must move away from carbon-intensive economies to low-carbon development pathway. That has been an hallmark of our engagement. The how to move it is probably what needs to be looked into, because we did in the African Climate Summit expect that there will be a resounding commitment among the African heads of states to push in a collective manner on the developed countries to cut on their emissions, because that is where the bulk of the emissions are coming from. 96% of the emissions are coming from there. So unless those countries do what is right, then we will not be making progress. Yes, indeed, there was a commitment around decarbonizing African economies through clean renewable energies, which is a plus. But fundamentally, and when you put it within an investment model, then it's a zero-sum game, because essentially what you've done is to create opportunities for foreign investors to continue to control the energy sector within Africa. In fact, Africa is one of the continents that pays high tariff for electricity, which again impedes the African capability and capacity to industrialize. So our expectation was that we will be able to move towards more radical proposition of people-centered energy control systems. So that again, through the people-centered decentralized energy system, we are able to move the energy sector, the stake in terms of ownership and control of the energy sector, to local people, and that people will not only do business with the energy sector, but will also will see an opportunity for investment, but the energy cost will come lower, and again, enable production and the creation of more employment opportunities. That's a conversational area that is still manhood, and that needs to be unpacked in quite a substantive manner for us to move to the next level. The finance question is neither here nor there, but the financing has been at the center of our conversation. Part of what we touted the African Climate Summit has not delivered effectively was on the conversation on adaptation. The conversation on adaptation were wish until the last minute in terms of what we were looking for, because we were keen that the African Climate Summit send us the adaptation agenda in its resolutions, because what Africa needs most right now is adaptation, and for it to adapt, it also requires a lot of adaptation financing, which is again the means of implementation that is still lagging behind in terms of global commitment for action.
Okay. Allow me to take you back to the climate justice conversation. And if you were to briefly explain to us, what are some of the key challenges that Africa as a continent is facing when it comes to addressing climate justice?
Well, part of the one I started by saying Africa is a vulnerable continent. And being a vulnerable continent, in most of the cases, it's actually negotiating from a lower pedestal in terms of power and in terms of resources. The biggest challenge in terms of advancing climate justice is first and foremost, noting that Africa emissions are far lower They also need to cut more for the temperatures to go down, so that again we have less instances of climate-related disasters are not taking urgent action as it ought to be. They are not too quick to reform their production models and production methods to align with a low carbon development pathway in a manner, speed, and scale that African continent does expect. So there is still that hang on production means and production methods that have been traditionally used. The second revolves then around geopolitics. Any small instance that takes place globally is a trigger to a kind of behavior where the developed countries are relapsing, going back to the dirty energy. And that's something that we need not to lose sight of. Look at the Ukraine-Russia war, which quickly triggered the Europe again to quickly move into to dirty energy, reopening coal mines that had already been closed, which is something that needs to be taken into account. But when you also flip it, you could see US again beginning to pre-position within that particular opportunity to see how to scale up their exploration of their oil fields, including the offshore oil exploration, in pre-positioning to take advantage of this. So the geopolitics, again, in part are not favoring Africa in terms of some certain critical processes that are necessary. Now, the third challenge then relates to the funding, the nature of the funding. Developed countries have always been very clear in terms of their approach, that we'll still look for opportunities where we can still do business, extract the remaining coin, extract the remaining bit of wealth that is still in Africa. So the business approach mentality of developed countries and the commercial and the private forces within developed countries that have actually held some of the states hostage in terms of making progressive decisions on climate change, all these continue to impede Africa and Africa's ability in terms of moving to the next level and looking at the best opportunities for Africa. Indeed, right now as we speak, if you talk about climate finance, that is, it's clearly, it's apparently clear within the climate finance that the interest of developed countries will continue to be paramount in all the processes. For instance, mitigation, which is more on cutting on emissions, became a priority in terms of investment. And it's not by accident, it's because within mitigation, there are opportunities for developed countries to invest in African countries in terms of the energy systems, in terms of the road infrastructure, improving them to be more efficient, among others. But when you look at the adaptation, which does not have a strong business rationale, there is less appetite to go in that particular direction. Right now, as we speak, developed countries are saying, we are not necessarily too ready. We've not developed the technologies, or we've not acquired technologies at scale to deploy them so that we are able to cut on our emissions. So what is our priority? Our priority is to continue to sell our extra units of carbon that we are producing to African countries through carbon market schemes, and we pay the African countries to sequester this carbon on our behalf, which means essentially even when we are trying to push for anti-carbonization agenda, there is behind the scene push for more carbon to be emitted as developed countries continue with their business as usual approaches in production. So the challenges are quite many, quite diverse. And then you compound this with the different, the level of unity within African countries. Are they united, or are they going for, are they engaging within the multilateral space collectively, or are they engaging in a bilateral manner? Mm-hmm. That again continues to weaken the African nations in a fundamental manner, such that they cannot be effective in terms of driving the kind of discourse that we want to see within that particular space. So we have all these playing together, and with, of course, African countries in a very selfish manner, some of them beginning to go for some specific deals. that weakens the African position.
Well put. So despite the challenges that you have just listed, such as technology and issues of financing, have there been any initiatives that have led to success stories when it comes to the climate justice conversation?
Well, I think there are a number of initiatives that are yielding successes. And every time Africa is actually approaching the negotiation from a unified position, that is yielding quite progressive steps. Every time Africa is able to quickly sit back and say, this is not what we need, this is how we need it, then that is able to yield progressive action. I think let me just begin by pointing out on the loss and damage agenda, which has actually been largely an agenda for the African countries within the negotiation process. And we've seen quite a significant push on the loss and damage, first and foremost, for the loss and damage to be accepted as a third pillar of climate response in global framework. And then thirdly, for the loss and damage fund to be operationalized in COP28. That has been quite a sequence of engagement where Africa is saying no negotiation, like for COP27, it was no negotiation without COP being an item. Actually, without loss and damage being an item in COP27, Africa was quite clear that they are not going to negotiate until loss and damage was brought on board as an item. The push for special needs and circumstances, that has been neither here nor there. But African continent has also been pushing for the recognition of the special needs and circumstances, but that has been mandatory with other countries and other regions also bringing their special needs and circumstances. And we've been very clear as Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance that the recognition of the special needs and circumstances of the African continent was actually embedded within the Paris Agreement. And it's because of, again, the location, the property, the other forces that add a big play, but also the greater vulnerability of the continent in this regard. But you see success being registered in that, and also the global goal on adaptation, which is also making some significant strides, is also part of the gains that you can hold on to. Climate finance still continues to lag behind because that is where the will and the rubber meeting. Unfortunately, it's always the last negotiation. It's a negotiation item that begins to take shape towards the end of any negotiation. So again, we probably need to reverse the order. I think also the negotiators also come without clear instructions on what to negotiate on the loss and damage. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like it's working for some countries and it's not working for others. And for those that are still lagging behind, how can they then secure funding when it comes to climate action?
Well, the climate finance conversation is a difficult one. It's not a straightforward conversation, because once the resources are mobilized and they have been put in a pool, then countries are supposed to express interest through proposals. And again, there are mechanisms through which the approval and the vetting process is done, both within the country and again within the host institution, the institution hosting the fund on behalf of the UNFCCC. So that is where the complexity is. Some of the countries are having what we can actually describe as non-functioning mechanism within the countries, where you find only one person, not even an institution, charged with the vetting process. And sometimes you cannot pin clearly who it is, what is their interest, and how they can fast-track the effort. And again, for you to attract funding at that particular level, you need requisite capacity. And in some countries, that requisite capacity is not augmented into a whole. So it's quite fragmented in different corners and different quarters. So another gap that exists there. Then at the global level, there are stringent, now within the bodies that administer this funding, there are stringent regulations and conditions that most of the African countries are expected to meet. Unfortunately, the majority cannot meet these regulations as it is. And that is why from the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, we've been clear in terms of our unequivocal call for review and reforming the conditions and the conditionalities for access to this funding, so that countries that have less capacities can be in position to access that. Within PACJA, we've been able to work with African designated authorities networks, which are networks of authorities at country level that are supposed to coordinate the delivery of this funding to countries. Basically to start asking where do we need to intervene. Number one, particularly around addressing the capacity gap, which is extremely critical, but more usefully beyond addressing the capacity gaps within the country level, beginning to look at how do we exert as a holistic whole to exert much more pressure at global level to drive the transformation that we are looking for.
Okay. Lastly, what do you think it's important to have community engagement and public awareness when it comes to issues of climate justice as we wrap up this conversation?
Having communities on board is a core for any transformation. Because first and foremost, it is communities who are at the front line of climate crisis. And not all communities, vulnerable communities, who are at the front line of climate crisis. So even as we begin talking about communities, we must see communities in a continuum, not just like one size fits all, in terms of who are the most vulnerable, what does their vulnerability look like, what are those inherent needs that need to be responded to for these particular communities, and what kind of capacity gaps do they have in terms of even articulating those needs. How do we support them to articulate these needs within all the spaces, and how do we ensure that climate financing and the policy programs within the climate response spectrum then connects with the aspiration? Because most of the time you'll find, let's pick for example, because your question is quite an interesting one. Let's look at African countries and globally. The plan that is actually laid on to capture the needs and action is what we call the nationally determined contribution. This year we are working on a plan to develop the third version of the nationally determined contribution across all the nations of the world. The first and the second nationally determined contribution were mitigation-centric, meaning that they were heavy in terms of focusing on initiatives that enable countries to cut on their emissions. The communities who are most affected probably have nothing to cut. It's your grandmother and my grandmother, they have nothing to cut in terms of emission, meaning that their interests is adaptation. So adaptation is at the core of their interest. But remember, it was not necessarily factored. And if it was factored not in a strong way in the NDC version 1 and version 2. So as we get to the version 3, then we're asking, where is the voice of these particular communities? And that is why PACJA, when we were beginning our campaigning process 2 years back, we started with the Climate Justice Torch. The Climate Justice Torch was a powerful tool for enabling communities who are at the grassroots, not only to marshal their voice, but to amplify those voices within the highest level of decision making, within the respective countries and within the Africa region, and all the way up to COP27. Right now, we are connecting all those voices with Keep Your Promise, which is basically, again, to say, countries, whether you are developing your national adaptation plan or the national determined contribution, we need to see that plan, the national determined contribution, the national adaptation plan, speaking to our aspiration, and we need to see funding from developed countries that is aligned to our priorities and that speaks to our interests. So essentially, this is why we are connecting all this mesh to form quite a strong influence block. Thanks.
I think we could go on and on, but time does not allow us. This has been a very insightful conversation. Thank you very much, Mr. Philip Kilonzo. You heard it from him, all the points and the nuggets of wisdom. This has been Climate Dialogues. Thank you very much for tuning in.